I'll begin first by introducing myself and welcoming you guys. Thank you for coming out to the Carroll Media Center for this program on pruning. A little bit about myself. My name's Steve Allgeier, and I work for the University of Maryland Extension, Carroll County. We've changed our names over the years. If you're familiar with Extension, we used to be the Cooperative Extension Service. Yeah. And then when I started, probably about 15 years ago, they dropped the word cooperative and we were Extension Service, and now just within the last 5 years we've dropped service out of our name. But basically we're really the same organization, and in Carroll County I think you all, meaning the public, are lucky because we have a pretty full staff and we provide a lot of services. Many people are familiar with the agricultural help we give, but we also have 4-H, and my hat or my domain is helping primarily homeowners and the general public with horticultural issues. And I also help to run a Master Gardener program. And if you're not familiar with Master Gardeners, they are kind of gardeners, I jokingly say, on the edge, but they're trained by the University of Maryland to help you all, the citizens of Carroll County. If anybody's interested in the Master Gardener program, you can pick up a flyer. We're having a training on May 23rd. It's a freebie, and it's really it's a 2-hour introduction to what Master Gardeners are all about. So if you're interested, please call my office, or you can send me an email. Either way, I'll get it. My email address is very easy. I stole the name. It's Hortman, like horticulture, so it's HORTMAN @UMD for University of Maryland .edu, and it's on the brochure here on the table also. Or you can call the Extension office, and our number there is 410-386-2760. My direct number is 2776. I started, as I indicated, about 15 years ago, and it's been a fun job. I've really enjoyed it because I enjoy plants and helping people. My wife at one point looked at me a little bit funny when she wasn't necessarily enjoying her career, and she looked and kind of scowled and said, "You really like your job?" And I said, "Yeah, actually I do. I get to do a lot of different things, but really my job is a resource for Carroll citizens." So, and this talk tonight hopefully will add to that. I've been interested in pruning for many years. As a kid growing up, I pruned Christmas trees on my uncle's farm. But one of the things that I noticed over the years is the lack of knowledge that many people have on how to prune. And I jokingly get a call primarily from a wife saying, "My husband is constantly pruning. He feels like he has to cut something." So I usually tell her to get a small plastic plant and let them trim that, or some plant that can take that type of abuse. But what we're going to talk about tonight primarily is how to prune trees. And a lot of times people think, oh, you need to hire an arborist. And sure, there are plenty of arguments for hiring an arborist. When a tree is 80 foot tall and it has a large dead section, or maybe a limb that's overhanging a house that looks like it's dying, or some other defect, yeah, that makes sense to call an arborist. But the pruning I'm talking about is before that tree gets big. One of the most important things you all can do is start it on the right path. Trees are kind of like kids. If you start them well and you develop structure in those trees, they actually tend to be less costly later on because you've encouraged better form and structures so they don't develop that dead crown or maybe that big limb that goes way off in one direction. So we're going to talk a little bit about what it means to prune structurally or formatively, and then we'll talk about how to make the cuts. I'm going to touch on some of the tools. I got a lot of tools laid out here. Too often I think we obsess over what the best tool is, and we ignore that, hey, maybe we need to think about how we should prune a little bit more than just what's the proper tool to make the cut. These things are important, but I think understanding the concepts is much more important than the tools. Okay, so we'll start first with just some basics, and then we're going to move outside and look at a tree that we planted, I believe, last spring, a small maple tree. And that's the time I think you all should look at trees and think, hey, what do I need to do for this tree? And why we need to prune. So, why do we need to prune? Trees, don't they just grow naturally? Any comments? Any ideas? Why do we need to prune? Okay, well, we'll cut to the quick. And really, if you decide, hey, I can't prune this tree, the first thing a good arborist will tell you is that you prune first for safety. You're looking at the safety of that tree in respect to what it could possibly hit or fall on or drop a limb off onto. And that's people, valuable things such as cars or houses. That should be the first point an arborist addresses. So even if you're deciding to hire one, you should be looking at safety. Then the next thing you're looking at is the health of the tree. Is there a cavity? Is there, again, a dead branch or a split or a crack that you're suspicious about? That should be the next thing that a good arborist would address. And then aesthetics comes further down the line. There's also specific types of pruning, and this might get into such things as fruit or to prune a hardwood tree up so that you can get good lumber out of it. But the things we'll be concentrating on and arborists should look at, especially for landscape trees, is safety, health, and then the beauty or aesthetics of the tree.
I got one question, Steve.
Yeah.
Why is it that sometimes you see the landscapers come in and they'll cut all the branches and everything off the tree so it looks like there's nothing there?
Well,
is that a specific type of tree you can do that on, or?
More than likely, no. More than likely, the person who comes in and does that doesn't understand pruning. And there are a lot of arborists out there that you see doing things to trees, and you wonder why they did that. That isn't really according to code or the proper principles established by. And this gets back to, if you are looking to hire somebody, I would look at somebody who has ISA certification. That's the International Society of Arboriculture. And it's a certification like any trade, but that certification stresses proper pruning techniques. And at least from what you're telling me, it sounds like that person probably wasn't using the principles they learned. And I see that happening also. And we'll cover some of those things in here also. And I think some of the times people trim heavily or over trim or do improper pruning cuts just to have evidence that they did work, that there's debris on the ground that they removed from the tree, and to satisfy the customer. And really, a well-pruned tree, I think, is a tree that the arborist walks away from after they're finished, and that person, meaning the owner of the tree, has a tough time figuring out maybe what was done to the tree. It isn't readily apparent. Some of the times that's many times that's a better pruning job than not. We have lots of big famous trees. Many of you probably recognize the Y oak on the left here. Of course, that isn't around anymore. The oak on the charter oak on the Connecticut quarter is well known. This large tulip poplar, I don't believe is around. It's in Montgomery County. But what I find interesting is we tend to cherish and value what I call the freaks of nature. These trees are anomalies that really we recognize as significant because of their size, but structurally they probably aren't the soundest thing to have in your yard. And the gist of my program is, hey, you know what? We don't want to develop trees that have these big spreading habits, and we'll get into why. Even though they're symbolic and they're emblematic, you see them on a lot of these state quarters and things like that. They probably aren't the best thing to have in your own landscape, and they can be quite costly to maintain just because of their structure. Where do trees grow? This is a softball. You guys should know this. It's out in the woods. There's my cousin hugging a big tree out in the woods. And one of the things that you notice, I hate to flip back too quickly, but this tree right here and this tree right here and this tree right here have relatively short trunks. And this tree my cousin is hugging has a very long straight trunk
primarily because it's growing in the woods. What's the big limiting factor that influences tree growth in woodlands? Light, and the neighbors kind of shading out the base of each other. That trees are really in a fight. They're struggling to get a hold of as much light as they can, and hence when you walk into a lot of these healthy woodlands, you find very straight trees like this one. Many of the bigger trees are very straight. They're reaching up and stretching for the light. Last February, what was it, February 14th? A lot of people woke up and the first thing they recalled at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning was the sound of what?
Tree falling.
Tree falling, limbs breaking. A lot of people said they thought it was gunshots because that ice storm that hit last February was so heavy. It really damaged a lot of trees, and people came in and were complaining about all the damage that the ice caused. And I wandered around Westminster, right downtown. This is on Main Street, right by the BB&T Bank, and this is up on West Main Street, and this is back behind King Park. So there was a significant amount of damage. And I talked with a couple arborists that were very busy for that whole week, that were cleaning up and trying to repair some of these trees, and many of them reported back what I had seen is a lot of these trees were damaged, of course, by the ice, but a lot of that damage occurred because they were predisposed to breakage. They had poor form or poor structure, and that much of this could have been avoided if somebody had taken the time when the tree was young to prune it structurally or to create a better habit or form. So we'll take a close-up. These, I'm going to bounce back, but these next 3 pictures are close-ups of the damage. And what we have here, this is the tree that was back in King Park right here. I got a close-up of the limb, and it has this limb sheared off and tore away. And you can see that there's some staining that went on in there. And I have a piece of, oh, right here. Another tree that had the same issue. It's called included bark, and it's when 2 branches tend to grow very tight together, and it creates a seam that really doesn't fully join. And this one was even better because actually I have it upside down. This is one side, and the other side's still standing, but growing in here was a seedling of another tree. And you can still see the roots continuing down right here. So structurally, the tree was predisposed to breakage because it didn't have a nice sealed area. And we have some pictures later on of other local trees that had the same problem. Some of these trees just had such a wide spreading limb structure that the lamination or the branch split apart. Again, the same problem with this. There was a poor branch attachment and a rotted area where that branch had joined, which probably could have been avoided if somebody had taken some time to do some pruning. And it doesn't mean that just because you start a tree young with good structure that 50 or 60 years or 30 years down the road you don't need an arborist. Trees can still develop bad habits later on, but by taking the time early on, many times you avoid these problems, as a lot of the arborists noted as they cleaned up. Again, this is over at City Hall in Westminster, a big sugar maple where you can see the branch split out, and it was has this telltale included bark where the bark had actually grown in between 2 branches that were very narrowly attached. Seems kind of strange, but a healthy branch union tends to be a union that looks more like a U rather than a very tight V. That's actually, you tend to get wood that will grow and grain that will grow to help support that branch. Again, this tree is now missing, but here's some of the reasons why trees fail, or at least branches fail. Codominant stems are usually 2 stems that are 2 distinct leaders, and that tends to split the energy of the tree, and that's not necessarily healthy for many trees. Now, some trees grow naturally that way. You think of some of the vase-shaped trees like elms. A lot of the big elms grow naturally that way, or zelkovas. You find those along a lot of urban landscapes. And we can improve their structure through pruning, but they still tend to fragment and create multiple leaders. Included bark I already mentioned. We've seen plenty of trees that have been around a little too long and maybe they've missed or lost too many branches on one side. And it creates an unbalanced canopy where all the load's over on one side. Sets my kids nuts when I stop. I'm always taking my camera out. Really, I should take my cell phone off just in case they call. Because I'm always taking pictures of odd-looking trees and they're rolling their eyes saying, come on, Dad, you don't need to do that. Large lower limbs, we're going to talk about this later on. Poorly spaced laterals. These are the branches that are off along the trunk. Some of the times they aren't spaced evenly around the trunk. And again, that's something you can remedy early on in a tree's life by pruning it properly. And the biggie is that, and you kind of brought this up earlier, is past pruning practices where people make improper cuts. How do we address these issues? Well, my thing is looking at a tree early on. This is over in the Walmart parking lot in Westminster. And I stopped and I looked at this tree, and it's kind of got that classic lollipop shape. A lot of people would call it a Bradford pear, but it isn't. Right. It's actually it's a tilia, or a basswood, or linden is a common name. But what happens is when these trees are grown in an open environment, you'll see this tree in a woodlands, and it has generally a long, straight trunk. Mm-hmm. This, all of a sudden, does what? It looks like a bunch of spaghetti or shoelaces. It's bifurcating and splitting off in many different directions as these branches come off. And it's creating very, very tight branch unions. You can see all these different V's. This tree, now it's in a parking lot, and parking lot trees generally don't live that long. They get hit by cars, they don't have much root space, they're suffering from the vagaries of all that extra heat. More than likely, this type of tree is very, very desirable for Japanese beetles, and we do stand a good chance of having lots of Japanese beetles this year because of our rain, and we talked about that earlier that we had last year. Mm-hmm. So this tree here has lots of problems, and at this point it has lots of problems because I call it the party's going on. Actually, a gentleman from Florida State talks about that. And what he means by that is this tree has unlimited resources, and that unlimited resource especially is sunlight. And pretty soon, rather than acting like a single tree, all these branches start reaching out for sunlight and kind of abandoning that principle of being tied to a tree and trying to grab as much sunlight as they can. So you get all these dominant branches growing out in different angles that shouldn't be found on a tree like this. Now, I was just taking pictures of cherry trees today and thought, man, they're great, they're beautiful. But hopefully, after you go through this program, you're going to look at trees differently, and you're going to try and look beyond that perimeter and start looking at the structure of the main branches in the trunk. And ideally, I think that's what people need to do when they prune trees. Rather than just shearing them and maybe making them nice and neat and meatballish, they need to look at the interior and see how the branches are spaced, and if it has a healthy habit. So, hate to say this, but if you pay attention, you'll start to look at trees differently. Again, over at the community college, red maples are kind of the drug of choice for the landscape industry. They're tough, they can grow pretty much anywhere without too many problems. Of course, if we overplant anything, it'll probably develop a problem. We've seen it with what? The American elm and chestnuts, and now we're worried about the ash because there's this new beetle. It's in Carroll County, emerald ash borer, and we're lucky. We don't have many ash, but in the Midwest it's costing them millions of dollars because they planted lots of ash after all their elms died. But we have red maple here, and you can see, looking at this red maple, there's kind of a central leader, but there's all sorts of other branches that are starting to compete for that central leader. So for a tree like this, it probably won't end well as it grows bigger and develops, because a lot of energy is going to be spent going out on these side branches, and many times you'll see this central trunk start to disappear. And you'll get this big, wide kind of lollipop or flat type tree with a poor central structure. Here's how it starts, and this is a great example right across from the Farm Museum in Westminster. Looking up toward the hospital, I saw this 17-foot tall red maple, and then maybe 60 yards down the road, there's a red maple that's taller. It's probably, well, I measured it, it was 41 feet. And I looked at it, and it looked funny. I saw this big branch coming off here, and I looked at this, and the branch union isn't bad. It's kind of U-shaped, but there's a lot of mass. This branch, if you look over here, is actually getting taller and almost taking over as the central trunk. This isn't a healthy habit. In time, this branch is getting so large that it could possibly dwarf this side out and eventually create an unbalanced tree, which you don't want. Is it redeemable? It would take a lot of work. You'd want to hire a professional to come in and start doing some special cuts to bring this side back into bounds. Something like this is more manageable. I still don't like to prune a tree like this that's that tall. You start having to grab a hold of these large telescoping pole saws to start to make your reduction cuts, and we'll talk about those cuts later on. So here's probably how this tree started, with something like this, with these multiple dominant leaders. And this is what you want to address early on in a tree's life. It's like raising kids. You just don't let them run all over the place. You need to give them a little direction. And that's hopefully what you'll get out of this pruning talk, is that direction. So it's all about suppression or redirecting the growth. And trees, we know when you prune a tree, and you all have seen this many times, when a tree is pruned real hard, you'll see all these suckers shooting up. And jokingly, the person I work with, Brian Butler, says pruning is a reinvigorating process. And you see that quite a bit. You see these trees that are pruned real hard, and then all of a sudden the next year there's all these sprouts coming up. That's a reaction that the tree's making to try and survive. It probably got pruned too hard. We're going to talk about maybe not doing that heavy cutting real hard on a tree, but making some choice cuts so you don't have that excessive responsive growth. That's not necessarily desirable in what we want to do. Okay, so first a little bit about how to make the cuts. There's two general types of cuts. One is called a reduction cut, and the other one is a removal cut. A reduction cut is just shortening a length of a stem back to a smaller limb. And that's, some people call that a suppression cut, some people, there's all sorts of names, but I think the industry is starting to move toward these terms. So a reduction cut, you're removing a larger piece. Actually, I have a pointer here. You're removing a larger piece back to a point of a smaller limb. And we're going to talk about some rules. Unfortunately, like any trade or art or skill, there's rules you need to follow. And if this piece that's removed is too large, it becomes, a lot of people will call it a topping or a heading cut. But this looks like a proper cut here, and we'll talk about where you make that cut also. A removal cut is when you remove a branch all the way back to its parent. And it could be back to another main branch, or it could be back to the trunk. But you're removing a smaller branch back to its parent. That's a removal cut. So it's pretty simple. That's your two basic pruning cuts. You can abuse both of them. You can do both of these cuts incorrectly, but we'll hopefully give you some ideas on how to do that correctly. The removal cut is, this is just more detail on the same thing. You can see this dotted line represents, and these slides actually came from the University of Florida. The removal cut is removing this entire branch back to the trunk in both cases. But you can see these little side branches are being removed back to their parent, which are the side or lateral branches. So again, that removal cut. And when we make a removal cut, and red maples are a great tree to teach with, is because they have nice smooth bark generally, especially in their youth. kind of like we do. We get smoother skin when we're younger, and then my skin is looking a little bit uglier as I get older. But in either case, you want to look for an area that you cut back to, and they call that the branch collar. And what's handy is, and if you haven't picked it up later on, please pick it up, this collar area is explained in this handout. This is from the University of Florida. And what you want to protect this region because it contains tissue that allows at least the tree to recover or compartmentalize that wound that you're going to do. And pruning is wounding. A lot of people hate to think of it that way, but it is a chance for infection. It is a chance for introduction of diseases or insects, but many times it is necessary. And if you're going to do it, you should be pruning at the correct area where a tree can recover, or at least you can give it the best chance. And that's why we tell people is look for this swollen area that's close to the trunk or the parent, and you want to make the cut just outside of that swollen area. Some trees it's hard to see. You have to look at it, and either the bark has a lot of fissures, but on this red maple, this is a great way to teach, and when we go outside, we can kind of point at that branch collar and say, hey, here's the point that you want to cut to. When you start to cut inside the branch collar, and here's a great diagram, I know I keep standing in front of the slides, here's the line that marks the point just outside of that collar that you want to make your cut. This type of cut is actually going to cut through that collared region, and it's going to be, it will be much more difficult for the tree to recover from that and seal off or compartmentalize that wound. So avoid cutting into that collar. Some of the times you have to remove a big branch. I've done it, I don't know how many other people have done it, where you've started to make that top cut on a branch and you didn't make your first undercut prior to it. What happens if you start to cut and you keep cutting? What happens if you don't make an undercut further back on the branch?
Split right in half.
Yeah, the branch will start to actually split and peel and rip. And some of the times that rip will continue down the trunk. And when you allow that to happen, that splitting and ripping, it destroys again that branch collar region. And it's difficult for then the tree to recover. And it's easy to go around and look at old pruning cuts that are done correctly, because you'll see, jokingly, I call it the donut. A lot of arborists call it a donut that forms, and it's pretty uniform, and it slowly encases and covers over that area. And inside there's also some wood that's developing that walls off that dead area. There's going to be a slight dead area. But when you have that ripping, many times you'll see on the bottom there's not that collared wood developing, or that donut. It's missing there, and some of the times it's missing on that top, and that usually means that they cut too tight or too close into the collar. Yell if none of this makes sense. Okay, good. So ideally, if you have to remove a large limb, first do an undercut, and that will stop or reduce the amount that rips out. If that branch starts to sag and then start to tear, it will tear down to this point and then drop off. And then a much later portion, this little stub will be left that you can make your final cut back to the collar. So ideally, you don't want to make those big cuts because they take time. They take a long time to recover. But some of the times you need to. Aspect ratio, we're going to skip over it for time, but we'll touch on it in some of the other things. A reduction cut is different. Reduction cut is when you're removing a larger branch and leaving a smaller branch behind. Basically, that smaller branch is inheriting the duty of the limb. But what the reduction cut does is it slows down or redirects the energy of the tree away from that branch. And that's the whole idea of reduction, is to suppress growth and redirect it in a more desirable direction on the tree. Reduction cuts are hard because many times there's no longer a branch collar to give you guidance. It's not easy to see any swollen areas, and many times there is not a swollen area there. This is less desirable to do. The removal cut, generally, if you have a branch collar, and it's a small enough limb, will recover very easily without any problems. But a reduction cut some of the times is necessary, and in order to make it, there's a general rule that you look for this branch bark ridge, and here's a piece of maple right here, and you can see this seam right here between these two branches. And you'll take a 90-degree angle from that branch bark ridge, which is this dotted line, and then you'll bisect that dotted line. You'll cut this angle in half, and that will be your final cut line. And the idea is that you allow water to shed off by having an angled cut. There's a little bit of play in here. You could actually reduce this to maybe something like this, because the closer you make a cut to a horizontal line, there's going to be less exposed wood than it will have to recover. But this is the general rule. Again, this is in many of the handouts. You can find this online also. But that's the formula that people use. The other thing to keep in mind is whatever your final cut is, try not to make it below the seam that's existing on the branch. So you know how to do a reduction cut and a removal cut, and we're going to get into why you do that. Here's actually a good example of why reduction cuts can be dramatic. This cherry tree had a reduction cut right here, and they cut open one of the, they cut open actually this dead portion, and you can see all sorts of rot developed, and is starting to develop this column of rot down into the limb. The existing living tissue right here is probably supported by a very thin layer and poorly attached to the tree, because this is all rotted. In time, as this branch gets larger, it will probably break away and shear away. I see this a lot in silver maples. Silver maples was the drug of choice back in the 30s and 40s for landscapes. People put in silver maples because they grow quick, but they have terrible form, and people started to recognize this, these giant vase-shaped trees in their backyard overhanging a house. So they started doing these reduction cuts and heading cuts and topping cuts, and they got lots of this rot that developed. Ideally, what I would say is, sure, you could prune it and probably get it back into good shape, but avoid the error by not planting a tree that has poor habit or is going to overgrow its welcome. Try and do a little research beforehand and not fall in love with a particular tree in the nursery when it's in bloom. Find out maybe how big that tree would get and if it's in the right location for what you need. Here's a reduction cut that was probably done a little bit better, and there's less rotted area. It's actually started to compartmentalize and seal off that wound. And we'll talk about some of those rules for reduction cut. I was walking down an alley here a couple weeks ago, pulled out my cell phone, took a picture. My kids rolled their eyes. And I looked up at this mulberry tree. Now, mulberry trees are kind of an alley cat tree. They can take a lot of abuse and keep growing. But here's what I talked about earlier, this responsive water sprouting that goes on primarily around a lot of these big cuts. Now, this tree was cut probably by the utility because it was starting to overhang the lines. They hate to do this too. The tree's in the wrong spot, but they aren't going to cut it down, so they come and they top it. So this is what happens when you cut too much. You get all these sprouts. In time, some of these things will break away, but for the tree's health, it's probably good to leave some of those sprouts and slowly pull them off. Trees that have, well, that's a pretty picture of me, but trees that have too many of these things removed don't then develop the callousing tissue that helps to seal off a lot of those open wounds. In this case, it may never recover. There's so many open wounds on it, but being a mulberry, my bet is that the mulberry will live. They're tough trees. Okay, let me go forward. Okay, so let's take a break. We'll look at some of the tools. Ideally, probably the best tool that you can buy are a good pair of pruning shears, and also, let me just turn this off, and also a pair of loppers. And loppers come in many sizes. And I had to laugh at myself because just for demonstrations, I purchased some of the loppers just to see which ones I thought would be better. And one of the things I have found, and you talk to any good arborist, is the more expensive hand pruners are worth it. And the type of hand pruners that are ideal for a lot of the pruning that you all would do are known as bypass pruners. And these are pruners where there's a fixed blade and then another blade that bypasses it. Really, the fixed blade isn't sharp at all. It's a receiver, and there's one sharpened blade that's just sharpened on one side, and it passes by and makes a very clean cut. There's different brands and makes, and again, this cheap one has worn out its welcome in my tool belt. It's very hard to manage. The blades no longer meet neatly, so there's a lot of tearing, and some of the times I'm twisting and trying to break, when in fact I should be pitching these out, but they're a great prop. So I think it's probably worth paying the $40, $50, or $60 if you count on using these things for a lifetime. Most of these, and you don't have to buy a particular brand. I hear people say, hey, Felco's it, but there's all sorts of manufacturers that make these better quality tools. The nice thing about these high quality tools is almost all the parts are replaceable. You can get new blades if you get tired of sharpening these, or maybe in time, I didn't bring them, but I have some tools that I've sharpened so much the blade just doesn't meet anymore. But a lot of these parts, the spring will come off and you can replace the spring that helps the pruner return. And in time the handles wear out. This is a relatively new pair that I got. I thought I was being smart. I bought one of the larger pair of more expensive loppers. These are just large bypass pruners set up the same way with a receiver that's not very sharp, but this blade is extremely sharp. These are for larger limbs. After I picked it up, I realized this is not a tool I want to use all day. It's heavy. Typically with loppers, you're reaching up high or reaching inside. It's going to require a lot of hand strength and endurance. There are plenty of loppers on the market. I found this at a yard sale, an old pair of Corona loppers for $5 or $6, and I sharpened them up, and they actually work quite well. Not to say that you should shop at yard sales, because at the very same yard sale, I bought a terrible pair of loppers. So small, I don't know what they're really for. But the same thing goes with pruning saws. Many times, this hand loppers are good for about 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch at most. The problem with many of these tools is you can cut something even bigger by putting a little top pressure on that branch and pushing it down so this cutting blade will cut more easily. But in doing that, you're also doing a lot of squeezing on the tissue that you're cutting through, and some of the times that'll crack and fracture that. So try and stay within at least 3/4 of an inch or smaller for these hand tools, the smaller hand pruners. And the loppers, again, it varies again on the size, but again, maybe 1 inch to 1.5 inches at most, or 1.25 inches at most. Once you get above that, then probably some of these folding saws are better. An inexpensive pull folding saw, probably got this for 10 or 12 bucks, is sufficient. It's not horribly sharp. But again, it's $10 or $12. It's kind of handy because it can fold it, although the blade doesn't meet very easily in the receiver, and part of that's probably my own abuse when I twisted the blade. But you can buy some of these higher quality folding saws that are very effective at cutting. They usually cut in both directions rather than being just a pull saw. They'll also cut in the push direction. This is a bit of an overkill, but you can cut things 4, 5, 6 inches thick pretty efficiently. 6 is maybe pushing it. You'll notice I make up a lot of my own covers if I don't have it. I've stabbed myself too many times. I travel a lot with these things, so I think it's good to invest in a tool that has a good cover. Some of these tools are quite sharp, and it's convenient to have a cover, because if you have a cover, especially one that clips on, then you tend not to lose it. And one of the habits I've gotten into, and I haven't done this with this tool, is I'll put yellow tape around the handle or red tape or something, because many of the times pruning is done in the fall or in the winter. You lay this on the ground and there's leaves on the ground, it can get buried very easily, and for me it's hard to pick up. So bright blue, red, yellow, whatever you want to decorate them with, it's probably a pretty good idea so you can find it and your lawnmower doesn't find it then the following season when you're mulching up leaves or something like that. It's hard on the blades. These are kind of fancy pole loppers or pruners. They operate on a pulley system, and generally they have a blade that comes up underneath. What I like about that is that it does limit your cut size. If you're trying to cut too big a branch, the weight of that branch is going to bind in here, and it makes it hard for these loppers to get through it. So it kind of gives you a check. There are less expensive ones that are combination pruning tools. I find that the lopper is probably easier to use for most people, even though it requires coordinating two hands. Many of these poles will telescope out and extend up 10 or 20 feet. The thing you need to keep in mind is, even though you have that reach, it's harder to control, it's harder to see. Some of the times I'll take out a little spotting scope just to see where I need to make the cut. But ideally, it probably means somebody should climb up into that tree and do some pruning if you're having to reach up that far, and that means looking and finding a good arborist that you trust. The saws are great, but they do limit you, because if you're cutting smaller branches up high, the branches start wiggling, and it's hard to get control first on the branch, but also on the tool itself, especially if you start to telescope this up 10 or 15 feet. Wow, what kind of control are you going to get way up in the air? So again, that usually means maybe I should send somebody up to climb and actually make the correct cut with a hand tool. Any questions on that? Yeah.
Just with your loppers there, one of the big dangers with them, I worked at Home Depot for like 9 years, is you got to really be careful with electrical wires.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're up there, you know, and so many accidents that occur, you know, with farm equipment. And
that's a good point, is safety is probably the first thing, and actually that's what I'm getting back to here is a lot of times we talk about the tools, but invest in a good pair of safety glasses. I had to laugh because I took the scabbard or covering off of one of these things, and it said, cut branches will fall down and cause injury, or something like that. At first I laughed, and I thought, you know, that makes sense. A lot of times we forget about that. You get in a hurry, you see something that needs to be removed, and the eye protection I find is particularly important. Too many times I've been cutting, especially sawing something that's up over my head, and a little sawdust, you can get out of your eyes, but man, it can take a long time and ruin a day. And some of the times I've gotten infections just because I got that sawdust in there, I started working at it. So I really like these glasses that wrap around and fit tight. These glasses, sure, they probably stop some of the sawdust. The biggest problem is on your head, it can still ride down beyond your eyebrows. I got bushy eyebrows, but still doesn't stop everything. And it still gets back there, where something like this, actually, I can wear my glasses with them and see what I'm doing. So again, I use this especially if I'm cutting anything that's producing sawdust, although it isn't a bad idea for larger branches that are overhead, because an eye poke from even a small branch can hurt the eye. So invest in at least a good pair of goggles or something that'll protect your eyes. A good picture of me, although I'm not wearing them, I got them up on my head. I can't say it makes me look any better. General rule is do no harm, and every cut when you're pruning should have a purpose. Don't just cut the cut. I see people out there snipping and snipping. I talk to arborists and they say they get home and they'll snip away at a tree and realize they were just snipping. They didn't come up with a plan, and that's hopefully what we'll do when we go outside here shortly, is come up with a plan. There I am looking good with my goggles on. There's a couple rules. I'm going to go through this quickly just for the sake of time, but I've already emphasized this, is start young and start early on a tree. I almost think it's never too early to start pruning a tree. You don't have to cut a lot off, but you can give it direction by much more easily by starting early on the tree. Minimize your cuts. We already talked about that. As the tree grows and you say, oh, you know what, we're going to keep some permanent branches here, try and space your branches about 18 to 24 inches apart along the trunk. And these are the main dominant branches. And what you want to do, and you see this rule being violated all the time, that very first set of 3 maples that I talked about being across from the Farm Museum, is the branches should be 1/2 or less the diameter of the trunk. And we saw that one big 41-foot tall tree where that one branch was almost as big as the trunk. I went out and measured it, and it's still, it's about 80% the size of the trunk. And also keep an even radial distribution, and that's what this picture is. As you look down or look up a tree, you should see a pretty uniform pattern of branches, at least the main branches coming out from the trunk. That's hard to do some of the times, especially if a tree's up against a wall or it has some shade on one side. I got a swamp white oak out in my backyard. I know I need to prune, and all the big branches are on the sunny side. The side that has the silver maple hanging over it hasn't developed as many big branches. So I'm actually going to encourage some more branch development by reducing those bigger branches on the one side. So you can kind of control that through pruning. More basic rules. When you look at a tree, many times, even if you buy a 6 or 7 foot tall tree, none of the branches on there will probably be your permanent branches. Those branches still haven't developed because the trunk isn't tall enough. And you see this especially along street side trees. They'll elevate those trees so there aren't branches in the first 12, 15, or 20 foot of the trunk. You don't want to do that all at once. We'll talk about that later. But again, try and keep your pruning cuts small, 2 inches or less on young trees, 4 inches or less on older trees. Obviously, some of the times you have to break the rules. Branch breaks off and you got a big, something 6, 8, 10 inch large branch to cut off. You still need to remove it. We'll talk about these reduction cut rules later on. The biggie is, boy, these are small percentages. Some of the times you can break that, but try not to remove more than 20% of the foliage mass on any young tree. And for larger trees, depending on the health and the species, you should keep that rule even lower, 5 to 20%. Again, it depends on how healthy the tree is, how big it is, how it's growing, and come up with a plan. Don't just prune to prune. I'm looking at trees right now in my yard, and I've pruned them a couple years ago, and I already know that I need to do certain things. And some of the things, I'm going to wait a couple years yet to do to that tree. So come up with a multi-year plan. This is a good example of this is a 15-foot tall tree, and you can see this. All these branches, according to Ed Gilman, are all temporary. The first permanent branch is here, and that tree still hasn't gotten to that point yet. And this is just showing what it looks like 5 to 10 years later. That permanent branch is probably this branch right here. That's right here. So all these branches are going to come off eventually over time. Now, why don't we strip off all the branches? I mean, you buy a lot of trees in the nursery, all the branches are removed from the sides. But why shouldn't we remove all the branches? What's that?
It's got to have branches to have leaves to...
It does. I've seen a lot of people, they call it elevating the tree, and they've elevated it so high, it's like a little cluster of, looks like one of those pom-poms on the tail of a dog that got groomed kind of funny, that you're cutting off a lot of the photosynthesis that can go on. Plus, you're changing the structure of the trunk. Trees that have been limbed up severely tend to have very thin trunks and trunks that don't have much flare or taper. And taper is important in a tree because the more taper you have, and pin oaks are notorious. You look at a pin oak, they have a big root flare and it slowly tapers up. Those trees hold up better to wind load because the whole trunk bends, whereas a trunk that's been limbed up and is very straight and linear tends to bend in one spot and snap much more easily. Now, in the woodlands, you see long, thin trunks because the trees develop that way. They have the advantage, though, of neighbors that absorb the wind, so they collectively dissipate the wind. But your landscape tree that's been limbed up and doesn't have any taper, that's much more prone to breakage just because it doesn't have any taper to it, especially with wind load. So we already kind of beat this one in the ground, but sprouts should be retained. And you see all these sprouts around here where this big cut was made. And what you find is if you remove all those sprouts, say the following year, the wood that would develop that would help to compartmentalize or seal this off doesn't. So the sprouts are a reaction, and it does help that tree to help compartmentalize and seal off that big wound. Now in time, sure, you probably want to start removing some of these sprouts because as they grow, we showed that one picture where the sprouts got real big and were more prone to shearing off just because they were poorly attached. But you want to leave them on there if possible. Now that looks like a pretty big tree. You probably don't want to crawl up in there and use your chainsaw, so maybe that's a job for an arborist. But eventually they can be removed. So if you remove those sprouts, you tend to get more decay around that large wound area. Case studies, this is probably the best one out there. Got to thank University of Florida or Florida State. Ed Gilman has this in his, actually it may even be in this handout, but this tree on the left was planted. And what do we see going on here? What do we have there? We effectively have two dominant or co-dominant stems there, which are going to become two dominant trunks. And what was great was they made one cut to this tree. They removed this one stem. It's an easy cut. Probably didn't even have to look anywhere because it was all what I call sapwood. That heals very quickly. And you can see it's been removed. Now look down the road 5 years later at this tree, how it developed. Can you tell where that cut was?
The one sticking up the side over there?
Actually, it's right here.
Oh, really?
That's it. And all it did was, this tree could have developed two trunks that were about this size and probably a little area with included bark where there's a little seam and it's prone to splitting. And what happened was, in just making that cut, the energy was directed away from this limb and into the center trunk. It's very simple, one cut, and it directed the energy out of this second dominant stem and back to the trunk, and it allowed this tree to grow a better form. Now sure, there's probably some stuff that can be done up here, but overall the structure of the tree is much improved. Again, here's some examples, and we won't go too much into aspect ratio, but we have a ratio that this is 8/10 the size of that trunk. It's not good to have that ratio. It should be smaller. The following year, the energy has been redirected away from this so that now this is 1/2 the diameter of this. Probably in 4 or 5 years, the ratio is going to be even lower. Again, this is a big tree that pruning was done on this side. This was 8/10 the size of this. And in time now, this is 0.6 the size of that. It's still not a pretty tree. But they did some reduction cuts further up on that branch. And it's slowly changed the overall ratio of those branches. For the sake of time, we've already seen pictures of included bark, and this is how it forms. And the tough thing about included bark is the tree actually works against itself. We know that trees grow up, they get taller, but they also put on a ring or more girth, kind of like we do. I've gotten bigger over time. And with that, when you have two pieces that are so narrowly fixed to each other, those rings will actually act as a wedge and start to create a seam that splits. And if you've been over near the post office in Westminster, I was walking and I looked at this. It was a windy day. This is an ash tree. Giant, but man, there's two big, I don't know how this thing stayed together, but it was windy, and as I got close to it, I noticed this crack. It almost ran to the ground. And as the wind blew, some of the times I could see daylight through this crack. This was waiting to fall apart. So I called the county and they contacted Walmart, which is this building right here, and sure enough, in a couple weeks, they took the tree down. We hate to see trees go, but in that case, that could have been a real liability. There were targets there. There were cars drive by there pretty frequently. If that split out and fell, that could have caused significant damage. So this could have been prevented. This form could have been prevented if somebody had chosen, back when it was small and it was just those two little pencil width stems, somebody said, look, I'm going to remove you and let this become the dominant stem. Now we have an expensive removal. They probably had to put cones out and whatever for a tree that potentially didn't have to be taken down if somebody had just taken a pair of hand pruners rather than a chainsaw and probably 4 or 5 people all day to take down that big thing. Just that could have resolved it, but it would have had to been done 20 years ago. Some trees try to heal up. Pin oaks every so often rejoin. We were out on a property. Here's the gap, and then it resealed, but it split again further up. So trees try to recover. Other pruning issues, this is rounding over. Let's get outside for the sake of time, and we still have some daylight. Let's look at some of these trees outside and what we can do with those and maybe come up with a plan for some of them. You guys ready? Yeah. We planted this tree actually last spring, I believe, with a bunch of high school students, and Carroll Media Center recorded that. We talked about planting trees. We planted both the redbud tree that's in front of me and this paperbark maple, a very slow growing maple. However, it can get large in time. A lot of people think that this is a small landscape tree, but if you have a chance to go to Brookside Gardens heading down 97, they have a very large specimen. I'm guessing 55 to 60 foot tall. I may be wrong. I've never measured it, never seen a measurement on it. This plant actually has been groomed, like many of these trees, by the nursery to have a relatively straight trunk. Let's stand back and look at its habit. In general, it does have some lateral branches that are starting to develop. The spacing is a little tight. And what else do you all see in this tree? How about
got a wound in the bottom down there, Steve.
Ah, good point. And that's one of the first things I tell people is some of the times look at the whole tree and see if it's worth pruning. Now, fortunately, this tree, this wound here, it does have evidence of the wounding compartmentalizing. I can still see a little bit of the dead heartwood or non-living heartwood, but the sapwood and the compartmentalizing wood is enough that I think this may close over. This was probably done either in transportation or maybe in production a long time ago. What's that?
The lawn guy.
Yeah. And that's actually one of the reasons, arguments, even if you don't like mulch or believe in mulch, it does tend to keep the weed whackers and the lawnmowers away from the base, and that's typically what I see. A lot of people complain, they'll point at the top of the tree saying, oh my gosh, a limb's dying. And good arborists, the first thing they do is they look at the bottom of the tree and see if there's any issues going on below ground or at the ground level. Ideal, if you do mulch a tree, and we'll do a real quick mulching thing, is try and expand your mulch out as far as you can. Keep it between 2 to 3 inches deep, but also keep it off the trunk. You don't want to hide anything down here. And if you need evidence that you're mulching, expand your mulch ring further out rather than piling it up. There really isn't any sense to making a big pile of mulch. And in expanding that mulch ring, you're also reducing the volume of root competition from the grass. Now, Americans love their grass, and I understand that, but if you want healthy landscape trees, you can give that tree a little bit of an edge by expanding that mulch ring out. A lot of these trees will have roots. This tree here probably has roots already coming out over to where I am. The tree roots spread much further than the drip line of the tree. The other thing I'd probably look at would be some of these branches that are starting to get relatively large. This branch at this point is probably more than half, or it's more than 50% the size of this. It might be 60 to 70% the size of this central leader. And the first thing I think you should do is, if you come up with a plan, is identify which branch, if it becomes questionable, you want as the leader, and then start reducing or subordinating the other branches that are competing with it. And really, that's the big concept in developing a strong central leader, is saying, okay, which one's going to be my leader, and then which ones will I choose to subordinate. Now, I could do all my cutting at one time, but I know that if I cut more than 20, 30, 40% or higher of that mass, I could be reducing its ability to gain nutrients and produce sugars by cutting off too many leaves. So I'll probably want to make some choices and say, you know what, I'm going to head back certain branches to a certain point. And for me, I would probably reduce the biggest offenders, and I would probably reduce this size back to maybe right below here, and we'll see if we can get a good cut in. And I would probably reduce this branch also back to the smaller branch and leave it at that. So what I'm going to do is just remove two of the branches that we talked about earlier. These little Velcro straps are pretty handy for holding on to cords. I know I was always tripping on them, and it's a great way to keep them together. So I'm going to reduce this one branch back to here, and you get a little tension on it, and then you can do a quick cut. And I'm probably, we're going to chase this one. I could take it back to here, but I'd be breaking a rule. If I'd reduced it back to here, this branch is less than a third the diameter of this. So sticking with my initial rule, I'll go up a little bit further, and I'm going to pull this down a little bit so I get a slightly better cut right about there. Good thing I have my glasses on. And I probably, since I want it, I said, okay, I'm going to keep this as my dominant stem. I'll pick out the largest of the two right here, and they're both pretty large. But this one's even. This one's slightly larger right here on this side, so I'm going to cut that off. Here it is. And it's probably a good habit to get into, is periodically picking up your limbs. I know I've gotten into this where I start looking up and thinking, where is my next cut, and walking and tripping. Now obviously the debris here isn't real large. But at this point, I'm almost happy with leaving what I have. Sure, there's some things I could remove, but I'll probably revisit those later on. It wouldn't hurt to say, okay, which one of these two do I want to make the dominant stem? And at this point, I could go with either one. This one's relatively straight, whereas this one further up goes off to the side a little bit. So I actually may leave that on for another year and see how they develop. If one gets larger than the other, then I'll select out the other one and keep that as my central stem. Coming out and understanding what you think your tree should look like, in time, I would probably want to remove this branch here because of the competition on the trunk. They're very close as they get bigger. And really, if I wanted to, I could say, hey, my lowest branch, permanent branch, could be one of these, or maybe one of these, and in time, I would shorten all these branches, but leave them on, because you can see as each time the trunk has a branch, it tapers a little bit. It gets narrower after each cluster of branches coming off the trunk, and it's just divesting energy in different directions. So it's nice to keep that taper, and one way of keeping it is, even if you decide to remove these branches, leave a portion of them on that trunk so that you continue that taper till you get to the point where you need to start removing them in order to develop the permanent scaffold. I think that's it. Any last questions?